She was disabled, but her strength was in never giving up her rights. That day, a police officer yanked her out of her car, ignoring her fear and the crowd forming around them. His actions would turn her into a symbol of something much bigger than injustice. What happened next will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. Sarah Thomas was a 38-year-old black woman with a disability, and her life had always required a delicate balance of independence and reliance on others. Sitting in her old yet reliable car in the parking lot of a local supermarket, she felt the weight of both her disability and the responsibility of caring for her sick mother. Her car, though aging, was equipped with special modifications, an adapted steering wheel, hand controls, and a ramp that allowed her to drive and get around, despite being in a wheelchair. On this quiet afternoon, she had just parked in one of the designated accessible spots, which were meant for people like her. The midday sun cast long shadows over the lot, and most of the other cars were gone, leaving the place peaceful and calm. Sarah's mind was focused on the task at hand, picking up her mother's medication and getting back to her quickly. It was a routine she had done many times, but today, something felt off. Her thoughts were interrupted when a police car pulled up beside her. The officer, a white man in his early 30s, stepped out of the car, his uniform crisp and his posture stiff. There was an immediate tension in his stance. His eyes narrowed as he approached Sarah's car, his expression hard and unapproachable. He tapped on the window with a sharp knock. "Ma'am, you're parked in a no parking zone. This area is for customers only," he said, his tone dismissive and his words heavy with judgment. Sarah blinked, taken aback by his tone, but she quickly gathered her composure. "I'm parked here because I need to go into the store. I have a disability, and it's hard for me to walk long distances. I'm not breaking any laws," she explained in a calm voice, though her heart began to race. The officer's frown deepened, and without a word, he ordered her to step out of the vehicle. "I'm not getting out. I have mobility issues," Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly with anxiety, but her resolve firm. He didn't care. His eyes remained cold, and his posture didn't shift. He stood there, unwavering, demanding she exit the car. The intensity in his body language, rigid, tense, almost as if ready for confrontation, made Sarah's heart pound. He wasn't hearing her, and she realized this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was something far more dangerous. The officer, clearly irritated and dismissive of Sarah's explanation, yanked the car door open without hesitation. The sudden movement startled Sarah, sending a jolt of fear through her body. Her heart pounded in her chest as her stomach dropped. She felt a wave of panic rising within her, but she fought to keep her composure. Every instinct screamed at her to stay calm, but the situation was spiraling out of control, and she felt powerless. The officer's eyes were cold, his jaw clenched with frustration, as he stood towering over her. The power dynamic between them felt suffocating. His hand reached inside the car, his fingers grabbing her arm with force. "Step out of the car now, ma'am," he commanded, his voice now harsh, more demanding than before. Sarah's breath hitched as she tried to find the strength to respond. The fear inside her surged as she clenched the seat of her wheelchair, desperate to hold on to something, anything, that would keep her from being dragged into the chaos. "I told you I can't. I'm disabled." Sarah's voice cracked, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. She was pleading now, but it didn't seem to matter. The officer wasn't listening. His eyes were filled with irritation, his grip tightening as he forcibly pulled her from the car. In that moment, Sarah's body jerked against her will, her legs struggling to find any stability. Her wheelchair, the very thing that gave her a sense of control over her mobility, was left forgotten in the car, a symbol of her vulnerability. She tried to steady herself, her arms trembling from the sudden force, but her body felt unmoored, as if it had lost the ability to hold itself up. Everything around her seemed to blur. Her vision tunneled, her breath quickening as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. People were starting to gather, their murmurs fading into the background. Sarah could barely focus on them. It was as if the world had paused for a brief, terrifying moment. The only thing she could hear was her own breath, shallow, frantic, as the officer's grip remained tight on her arm, pulling her further into the storm of confusion and fear. As Sarah was pulled out of her car, the noise of the moment seemed to shift. At first, it was just her and the officer, but soon a small crowd began to form. People started to gather around, some simply standing there, others pulling out their phones to record the escalating situation. Sarah's heart raced. She wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair anymore. She had become the center of something much bigger. The reality of being watched, judged, and possibly filmed was sinking in. She could feel the heat of the stares from the growing crowd, some sympathetic, others judgmental. Some faces reflected concern, while others wore expressions of confusion or judgment. The onlookers seemed divided, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. A young black man, his voice shaking with indignation, stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "Yo, what the hell? She's disabled, man. Why you treating her like that?" His voice cut through the tension, but the officer didn't even flinch. He kept his grip on Sarah's arm, pulling her roughly away from the car. Sarah struggled to free herself, her body trembling with a mix of fear and frustration, but she was no match for his strength. The more she tried to break free, the tighter his grip became. Then, another voice rang out from the crowd. "This is wrong. She's disabled." The words echoed in the air, but the officer seemed impervious to the growing chorus of voices. His anger was rising, his face reddening as he barked at the people to stay back. The situation was escalating rapidly, and Sarah could feel her fear tightening around her chest with every passing second. Her limbs felt weak, and her breathing shallow, as the officer's aggression ramped up. Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out, her eyes quickly scanning the message. "Sarah, I'm on my way. Stay calm. Everything will be all right." It was from her sister, Aisha. The message, though brief, gave Sarah a sense of relief. Aisha was a lawyer, someone who had spent years fighting against police misconduct. Sarah knew that once Aisha found out what was happening, everything would change. Aisha wouldn't let this slide. And suddenly, Sarah felt a spark of hope amidst the chaos. She wasn't alone. As the officer continued to argue with the bystanders, a black woman in her late 40s stepped forward from the crowd. She wore a professional outfit and had an air of authority. She walked directly up to the officer, her voice firm. "Is there a problem here, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but commanding. The officer turned to face her, momentarily taken aback. "This woman is refusing to follow orders. She's in violation of parking regulations," he said, his voice now defensive. The woman raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Do you know who this is?" she asked. The officer hesitated, looking Sarah over. He was clearly confused. "No, ma'am, I don't," he said. The woman turned to the crowd, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "This is Sarah Thomas. Her sister is Aisha Thomas, the head attorney for the Civil Rights Organization. I'm sure you're aware of her work. Now I suggest you let this woman go, before this turns into something much bigger than you bargained for." A moment of stunned silence passed. Then the officer released Sarah's arm. He took a step back, his expression a mix of guilt and uncertainty. The woman who had intervened turned to Sarah and gently helped her back into her car. "You're all right now," she said softly, then turned to the crowd. "This is not the time for silence. Record everything." By the time Sarah's sister arrived, the officer was already gone. The media had arrived too, and the story of the incident quickly spread across social media, sparking outrage and calling attention to yet another example of police misconduct toward Black people with disabilities. The shocking twist wasn't just that Sarah had been mistreated. It was that the system that allowed such behavior to happen had been exposed. Sarah, with the help of her family and the public support, became a symbol of resilience and a powerful voice against racial and ableist discrimination.